I'm John Leland with Montana Power Company, 40 East Broadway, Butte, Montana. Two things I'd like to do this evening, as you indicated, Commissioner Rowe, is first to introduce the resource plan and give a little history and discussion with respect to the plan. And secondly, I'd like to talk about the comments that were requested yesterday for us to respond to. Montana Power Company's lease cost plan, which was filed with the Commission in March of 1993, was the result of several years of a collaborative process which involved our Conservation and Lease Cost Planning Advisory Committee. This particular committee is made up of 7 members which meet monthly and discuss conservation and lease cost planning activities. The collaborative process started in October 1988, and 2 years later, in October of 1990, produced a document that was to the Montana Power Company and the Montana Public Service Commission. And these were recommendations regarding the lease cost planning and conservation activities. Shortly after that, or about that same time, the Montana Public Service Commission actually entered into some rulemaking process or guidelines. And that continued for a couple years until December 1992, in which the integrated lease cost planning rules were formed and signed. Shortly thereafter, March 1993, is when we filed our first integrated lease cost plan. The plan that we developed used the lease cost planning process that first examines the need for resource, and our need for resources in part premised on the loss of 2 contracts in 1996, one with the Bonneville Power Company and the other with Idaho Power Company. Both those contracts are non-renewable. In addition to those contracts, of course, we have load growth over time, which requires additional resource. Recognizing this need in 1991, Montana Power Company went out with an RFP, or a request for proposal, in July, and we received bids back in December 1991. Those bids totaled more than 6,000 megawatts of resource. For comparison purposes, our total peak load in the wintertime is about 1,500. So we received a substantial number of resource bids. We used the integrated lease cost planning process to evaluate those RFP resources, plus other resources that were Montana Power Company owned, resources such as Thompson Falls and other hydro upgrades, and our Conservation Energy Plus program. By August of 1992, we had whittled this list down to what we call our short list of 13 resources, and continued an analysis of that through the fall. This plan those resources were ultimately formed the plan, which was filed in March. The integrated lease cost planning process involves 5 points in our multi-attribute decision rule. That rule is a mechanism, if you will, or a methodology that we use to analyze and find the best resource plan when you put all the various resources together that meet our needs. The elements of that rule is our customer, the investor, the environmental, and reliability. And in addition to that, there's a strong analysis of risk and uncertainty. And that is all accomplished and balanced when we make this plan. Now, with respect to our plan, there are several resources in what we call our preferred plan, or the plan that has been filed, and as you mentioned, will be used in the upcoming rate cases and ultimately other matters. There are near-term resources that are non-Montana Power Company resources that are in the plan. Those resources include a purchase from the Basin Electric Cooperative. This is a purchase for winter energy, and it's 98 megawatts. It starts in 1996, or that's what we're contemplating. We're looking at acquiring potentially these resources, and negotiation is continuing. We have an extension of an existing exchange with the Idaho Power Company. This is 50 megawatts, and it is different than the purchase that I mentioned a little while ago. In addition to that, there's a 15 megawatt potential resource from the Stone Container Corporation, which is just outside of Missoula here. The other near-term resources that sponsored by the Montana Power Company include our conservation program, or E+, and by the year 2002 we anticipate approximately 114 megawatts of resource from that source. We're also looking at transmission and distribution efficiency improvements. This is approximately 11 megawatts by the year 2002. In addition to those two efficiency improvements, or efficiency methods, we're looking at upgrade potentials at our Thompson Falls facility outside here, in Missoula here. It's 41 megawatts, and potentially an upgrade or refurbishment of the FW Bird plant in Billings, and that would be 60 megawatts. There are resources in the plan that go beyond what we consider our near-term need. Our near-term need is really probably out to the year 2000. And those resources are another company-owned resource, the Ryan upgrade, potentially in the year 2001, and we're working to further analysis of that resource, and that may ultimately or may not come in as a resource into our plan. We're also looking at combustion turbines through the year 2005 and 2007. These resources that I've mentioned here are all peak types of resources versus what we call a base load or energy resource. Our need, base load or energy resource. Our need through past the year 2000 is for peaking kinds of resources. There are several resources within the plan that we consider to be non-discretionary. That includes a Billings Generation Incorporated resource of 52 megawatts. It's in Billings. It's online, expected to be in 1995. There's upgrades at Milltown, Hauser, Rainbow, and Madison. Maybe upgrade is not the appropriate word, but these particular facilities, their generation is old. It's been in place for a long time, and there's safety-related problems, and there's just pure efficiency improvements by putting in a different generator. Those range about 13 megawatts of winter peak capability. We're growing about 20 megawatts here, so it's probably about half. Also, there's a Flint Creek 1 megawatt potential hydro resource coming in a year or two. That represents the Montana Power Company's resource plan as it has been presented to the Public Service Commission. Now I'd like to go into the comments that we were asked to provide concerning several of the comments of the stone container written comments. In particular, we were asked to respond to comments 2 through 6 on page 4 of their written comments. And I would like to pass out these particular comments. I hope I have enough copies. Before I get into the summary, I do not plan to read these, but before I get into the summary, I might mention that these will be sent out on the distribution list tomorrow. We just completed these real late this afternoon, and so they'll go out to the mail for everyone to have a copy tomorrow. The first point was we were asked to respond to was the comments made on job creation. And basically, this comment focused on one column in what we call illustration number 2 of our resource plan. And basically, there's I believe, a misunderstanding what really that column represents. And let me just describe what the column represents, and I think that will hopefully clear up the misunderstanding. This particular column was used in the static screen to note whether or not a resource would create a significant significant number of new permanent in-state jobs. When we analyzed the Stone proposal, we found that, in our opinion, that there would be not a significant change in the number of jobs, especially new jobs, resulting from either of these two projects. So if a project had created a significant number of new jobs, then that column they received a yes. If they did not, received a no. So in this case, we indicated that Stone did not create a significant number of new jobs. We did realize or recognize that most resources, whether it be supply side or demand side, would create short-term jobs during the construction or acquisition phase. This wasn't used in the ranking within this or determining whether it was yes or no. We were looking at just long-term jobs. And just a matter of looking how this came about, and the reason that we did it this way is that in 1992, we went to our Montana Power Company management and to the Conservation Lease Cost Planning Advisory Committee and asked them about what we call socioeconomic considerations for both supply and demand side. And what we found out, and the input that we received, was that this is very complicated when you start talking about socioeconomic, and there seemed to be no general agreement that we could understand at the time concerning the costs or benefits. So given that information and given where we were in the analysis, what we did is we merely just noted whether or not it had long-term jobs, and then we used this information more or less as a tiebreaker if we would have had a tie between resources, which did not happen. So it actually didn't enter in directly into the analysis. However, in this next planning cycle, we do plan to take a closer look at this socioeconomic benefit costs, and we plan to work with our advisory committee and those that participate through the public process in that fashion. The second one was the project life, comments concerning the project life. The Stone, as we received their bids for both their, what we call their B and C, we received a 15-year proposal from them, and that was in their bid. There was some confusion, is it 15 or 16 years, and that was noted in the Stone comments. Well, actually it's a 15-year bid, but we asked the response to the bid to go in what we call operating years rather than as the way that was bid during calendar years. An operating year starts in July of one year and goes through June of the next year. And so when you put it on an operating year basis, there are actually 16 operating years versus 15 calendar years. And it appears that in the write-up of the book, those two weren't clearly designated, and so some places it was 15, other places it may have been said 16. Another element of the project life was there's a potential for the Stone proposal to have a longer life than 15 years. And actually this came forward after the bids, what we consider were closed, which was in December. And we were, NPC, were very cautious, if you will, of allowing any changes in the bid for several reasons. That is, if we had allowed changes in any of the particular bids that we had, obviously the process would have been much more complicated in trying to keep track of everything. Secondly, the evaluation period, I'm sure, would have been lengthened. And the third thing is probably the most significant concern, is that it would have been very difficult to have fair and equal treatment for all bids. So rather than making changes throughout this whole time frame when we were making the analysis, what we chose to do is to wait until the short list of resources was developed in August, and then deal with the short list of resources and make particular changes if appropriate at that time. We did recognize also that there was a possibility that the contract or the Stone resource would be longer length than 15 years. But we looked at it kind of in this fashion. First, when we did the analysis, what we call the static analysis, we found that both stone projects, Stone B and Stone C, passed to what we call a dynamic process when we examined it with a 15-year life. Likewise, when we put it into the dynamic analysis, it also was passed, and both projects went into what we call our short list. So actually, both projects made it to the short list looking at that project under a 15-year life. And now we're in the process. One of the stone projects we're looking at very carefully. It's what I mentioned earlier in our Stone B. And this potential for a longer life is being recognized in the discussions, and we realize that. The third item was flexibility. As we received the bids for the resources and we looked at the stone proposals, we did not at that time understand that there would be flexibility available on time, or online flexibility over time. And actually we learned through a conversation in September with Stone that there indeed was probably flexibility in the proposal. Well, actually, our risk and uncertainty and information which this comment was drawn actually occurred in June and July of 1992. Our knowledge became known after that time. But we did realize in what we call our dynamic analysis that the flexible online dates was maybe something that we could negotiate if that hadn't been bid that way. So in fact, in all of our resources that were used in the dynamic analysis, we used a flexible online date. And so we did not constrain the resource by that date as submitted through their bid. And as I said, we anticipated that if the resource plan suggested that a particular resource come on at a different time, that was something that we would deal with in the negotiations. And it should be, at this point, I'd just like to point out that the information that's presented in our lease cost plan, the document, represents the information as it occurred and as we were making decisions. That is, we did not, once we had new information available to us, we did not go back and change the documents or information that had made the decision. So the information presented in the book is as we were looking at it and is as we understood it at the particular time the decisions were made. We do have some new information on a lot of the resources now, and that's being folded in to our thinking. But the information presented in the book is as we were looking at it when the decisions were made. The fourth item is environmental externality. And there's some confusion and misunderstanding, I think, in what's being stated and discussed in the Stone comments. And let me go through and break this into two pieces. First, in the technical document where this appears, there are two things that are discussed within that attachment. One is what is the effect of what we call our Environmental Externality Adjustment Factor, or EEAF, for each of the resources. How would that change if we had used a different method to analyze the environmental impacts? That's what we call our static analysis. And that was on page 1 and 2, and a discussion of that was on page 1 and 2 of that attachment. And it appears what happened is that they looked at the graph that was shown in that attachment rather than going to the actual data. The graph actually used summary data to plot points. That is, it used 4 or 5 or 3, however how many resources, let's say, that were natural gas cogeneration or coal-fired or hydro. They were all added together and averaged to come up with a number that was plotted on the graph. So what we really needed to do was go back to the actual data in the attachment and look at what actually happened there. And that particular graph or table is reproduced in part within the book here. And the discussion in the Stone comments was that the bird firming was considerably more sensitive to to what we called our New York EEAF methodology than either of the Stone projects. And as we were looking at the data, known to us at that time, that simply was not the case. We can, in fact, see that the bird firming falls between the two, what we call Stone B and Stone C, in the sensitivity to the changing in the methodology to identify environmental externalities. And again, we have updated information with respect to Stone C and understand that their original proposal, which did not include NOx controls on that turbine, indeed now has that. So that's new information, but it wasn't available or factored in this analysis at that time. The second piece of the environmental externality goes beyond the static analysis and asks basically the same question, but it asks it in terms of resource plans. The static analysis looks at one resource versus another resource versus another resource. Here we're taking the resources and actually building resource plans. And the question was, how does the plan, or how would a plan change in terms of its resource selection, or the resources that were included in that plan, if we had used a different environmental externality adjustment factor methodology? And so the intent of that was just to describe and understand the sensitivity of the resources that were being selected. And merely the comments that were made in pages 2 and 3 of this report, or in Appendix F, I believe it is, they just merely represent the conclusions of that analysis. And we didn't try to tie results from the static analysis and the dynamic analysis into one sentence or into a concluding comment. We separated the two and just we're trying to examine the risk associated with choosing different environmental externalities. So that was the purpose of that, and I think there was some misunderstanding on the comments that were made. The next element is environmental uncertainty. And we definitely understand the information that was presented in that particular comment with respect to Stone B, and likewise with respect to Stone C. We are currently taking this information into account when we look at the Stone B project during the negotiation stage. And as I said many times before, this information really represents what we understood at the time, that the risk and uncertainty analysis was going forward and was not updated or changed as a result of new information. So in concluding, I think the statements that were made in reference to these 5 elements, really they're not correct. Montana Power does not have a bias against demand-side management or demand-side activities. And in fact, if you look at our action plan, 2 of the 7 action items include statements about how we're going to deal with demand-side activities. And in fact, a third statement focuses directly on Stone B and how we're dealing with that. And it says that the acquisition of this resource to meet load under the base or high load growth condition depends on the outcome of further evaluation and possible future negotiations. When we're looking at resource acquisition at this point in time, we look at resources under our base case load growth conditions. So what that simply means is that we are currently negotiating with the Stone project acquisition of this resource, Stone, along with our other conservation programs and the other resources in the resource plan. They're all possible. And as with any negotiation, acquisition will only come after successful negotiation. Finally, we believe that our lease cost planning process provides a thorough analysis of the individual resources and the resulting resource plans. MPC's multi-attribute decision rule does not favor one type of resource over another. Believe me, MPC fully realizes the consequences of favoring one resource over another, especially if it's the Montana Power Company resource. And with that, I will conclude and I guess answer any questions or clarify anything that's necessary.
Your question right now is based on small brewery. In that case, consumer council, Wisconsin, Leland's presentation of
My name is John Bushnell. I'm a staff member of the Montana Consumer Council. My business address is 34 West 6th Avenue, Helena, Montana, 59620. The Montana Consumer Council is a state agency whose charge is to participate in utility filings and rate cases before the Public Service Commission. And I filed previous written comments on behalf of the Montana Consumer Council with the Commission. And the comments that I'll be making tonight are a subset of those comments. First of all, I'd like to say that what our comments are not. And our comments are not an opinion as to the final resource selections made by Montana Power Company. The PSC has wisely avoided pre-approval in its lease cost planning guidelines. And our observations are to assist Montana Power Company in its lease cost planning process. I have two general areas to comment on, and one will deal with what I term emerging industry standards for lease cost planning throughout the United States, and Montana Power's compliance with the Commission's guidelines. In general, an industry standard format for integrated lease cost planning will include several sections, including a demand forecast, a review of supply-side resources, a review of demand-side resources, then a resource integration that integrates supply-side, demand-side resources, an uncertainty analysis, an action plan, and typically involves public involvement. I'll go through several of these sections, but not all of them. On the supply-side resource side, the Commission's guidelines suggested a strong suggestion that the plan be transparent, that members of the general public be able to understand the comments of the lease cost plan. Generally, we find that Montana Power has done a pretty good job identifying supply-side resources. We found that the competitive bid helped a great deal in this area. However, the plan has a lack of cost information, both from a production point of view and environmental cost standpoint. Demand-side resources are a term for resources that are obtained from the demand side, and that includes conservation. Montana Power had a very short section on demand-side resources. We felt that this presentation of demand-side resources was unbalanced with its supply-side resources. That typically a lease cost plan will identify a broad range of individual conservation measures or demand-side measures, that those measures will be individually evaluated for cost, technical potential, the size of the resource it can generate, and that those resources will be ranked individually and compared to the utility's avoided cost, or the cost that it avoids by saving a kilowatt hour of electricity. Then individual demand-side measurement or conservation measures will be ranked and grouped into programs, and those programs will then discuss various attributes of the program, and then in the company's action plan, they will generally provide a commitment to resource acquisition of that program. We find that Montana Power didn't do any of this in their lease cost plan, and had a very short discussion of the demand side. Montana Power does have a very short section on fuel switching, and as some of the public is aware, Montana Power is currently engaged in a pilot fuel switching program in Missoula, and we find it disconcerting that Montana Power jumped into a program without identifying it in its lease cost plan and having a technical discussion of the merits of fuel switching, and and expanding that section. In the resource integration step, the company takes resources from both the demand side and the supply side and integrates them into their resource plan. Montana Power's tabulations do not clarify how Montana Power plans to meet its loads. It leaves it short peaking capacity in many years of the plan. This is particularly important since this plan will be the basis of a marginal cost of service study and rate design study that Montana Power intends to file in the end of July. Typically, the last part of a integrated lease cost plan will be what's termed an action plan. And basically, the company will summarize its plan and commit to taking certain actions as to that plan. We found that Montana Power's plan does not have enough detail in its action plan. We are very concerned that Montana Power is conditioning its demand-side management efforts and its conservation efforts on Montana Power Company's view of rate treatment, including lost revenues. And we feel that certain statements within the plan are inappropriately holding integrated lease cost planning hostage to gain leverage in future rate filings. Lastly, in the action plan, there's typically a section that will detail improvements that can be made to the integrated lease cost planning process and the methodologies, and there is no such section in Montana Power's lease cost plan action plan. In conclusion, the Commission purposefully left flexibility in the guidelines, and we feel that's necessary. However, we think that Montana Power Company ought to come into line with what has been termed the emerging industry standards for lease cost planning elsewhere, and that there are certain critical deficiencies in the plan as it stands, particularly the capacity resource deficiencies in the resource tabulation. And that our recommendation in the written comments and our recommendation here today is that the Commission should have Montana Power resubmit its plan, and that the Commission, in drafting a letter or whatever action it takes in making a recommendation to Montana Power, that it be specific in telling Montana Power exactly what it wants. There's been a number of good comments, a wide variety of good comments by a wide variety of parties in this process, and we believe the Commission can use those comments to direct Montana Power in the way that it should resubmit its plan. Those are my comments, and I'll take any questions now on these comments or on my previously filed written comments.
Mr. Bushnell asked you a number of questions yesterday. Just briefly, how far down the road that you're suggesting do you think Montana Power's written response that was provided yesterday and the written response that was provided tonight, together with their oral remarks yesterday, get us?
Well, there was an oral remark yesterday made by Mr. Leland that I didn't comment on yesterday, but since you asked this question tonight, I'll comment on it. I think Mr. Leland said something like, if we were to refile our plan, I don't know what we would refile. And I think that that's telling. I think that they've determined that this is it, and they've maybe not quite had their ears open and listening to the comments of all the parties, but there's certainly areas that Montana Power can improve in their lease cost planning process, and they should be open to those, and that if the Commission, I think it's also telling that if the Commission does require the company to refile, that it needs to be specific in telling the company exactly what it wants. Obviously, the comments to date haven't generated any ideas for Montana Power, so I would caution the Commission to be very specific and detailed in what it expects in additional filing or refiling.
To what extent is that kind of specificity inconsistent with the flexibility that is built into the rules?
Well, I think the flexibility allowed the company to file the kind of plan it did, and that given that flexibility, I would say that they haven't met industry standards, and that if the commission agrees they haven't met industry standards, that the commission should say, this is how we think you need to bring your plan up to snuff, and provide that kind of detail.
What's your argument for requiring them to refile the plan this year rather than providing them guidance for the next plan?
Well, the next plan, as the general public may not know, the next plan is not required for another 2 years. And particularly if the plan is left capacity resource deficit, it doesn't provide a very good starting point for determining marginal capacity costs in this next filing that's coming in at the end of July.
Do you have any off-the-cuff responses to what Montana Power supplied this evening?
No, I don't.
Thanks. Are there any additional questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Hauser, I just saw your name on the list of people to testify. I apologize for not asking you to come up before Consumer Council. Do you have anything you want to add at this time?
I would give it over to Ron.
Great. Thanks. Mr. Mueller, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Commissioner Rowe. My name is Gerald Mueller. My business address is 7165 Old Grant Creek Road, and I appear this evening as the coordinator, more or less the spokesman for the Montana Power Company's Conservation and Lease Cost Planning Advisory Committee, which has already been referred to here tonight. What I want to do is just for a moment step back away from the more detailed comments on the plan, which we've already started to get into, and we will hear more about from other folks, and just spend a few minutes talking about why, as you said, this is a historic process that we're involved in. It's historic for two reasons. First, it is the first plan that Montana Power Company has filed pursuant to the Commission's guidelines, but it's also historic because it represents the product of a new way of doing business for the Montana Power Company. It's a new way because MPC has taken the steps to involve in its planning and seek the advice of people that normally show up, people and groups that normally show up at the rate case and in other regulatory processes as Montana Power Company's opponents. The advisory committee that was created in 1988 to give Montana Power Company advice about its conservation programs and its resource planning process includes District 11 Human Resource Council from here in Missoula, an advocate for low-income people. The Northern Plains Resource Council, which is an environmental organization, the Montana Environmental Information Center, another environmental group, MPC's large industrial customers, the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, the Northwest Power Planning Council, as well as the company itself. Now, that group did meet for 2 years beginning in 1988 and developed a series of recommendations to Montana Power Company, which is, people might refer to the Red Book. I don't know whether they have so far this evening, but they may otherwise later on. This includes the recommendations of this advisory committee for Montana Power Company. The recommendations, I think, have changed Montana Power Company's planning process. Those recommendations dealt with sizing the conservation resource for planning purposes, some specific steps that Montana Power Company needed to take in order to ensure that conservation is in fact treated equally with traditional generation resources in its planning processes, how to factor in environmental costs and benefits into its planning process, how to assess uncertainty in load forecasts and future resource costs and availabilities, and the risks that arise from that uncertainty in the planning process. We also recommended that the company conduct a competitive resource acquisition process that would allow non-utility resources to compete with traditional company-owned resources. This competitive resource acquisition process is a way, in effect, to test Montana Power Company's resource plan against the marketplace. It's a way for us to see if, in fact, Montana Power Company is planning to acquire the least cost and least environmental impact resources that are available to it. Now, as John Leland mentioned, the advisory committee has met almost every month since issuing its recommendations, and MPC has consulted regularly with us while the plan has been developed. Just one anecdote so that perhaps people could understand what kind of a difference this makes. When I first joined the Department of Natural Resources in the Energy Planning Division back in the 1970s, we were considering the Colstrip application and project. My first trip to Butte was with the attorneys from the Department of Natural Resources. We were attempting to do discovery to find out the basis of MPC's planning processes in those days. And we were shown into a room with no tables or chairs, and the documents that we were supposed to examine were all over the floor. Now, if you contrast that with what's going on today, John Leland regularly shows up with stacks of documents and overheads and has been willing to share with these folks, as I said, who have been their traditional opponents, as much detail as we are capable or willing to examine. So things really have changed, and the public does have a much greater opportunity now to understand and influence what Montana Power Company's resource planning results will be. Now, the committee did submit written comments to the commission as a part of this process. Those comments didn't make judgments about specific resources in the plan, but we did make 4 general comments relative to the documentation that are in the plan. As just to step back for a minute, the reason that we didn't make more specific comments is that the individual members of the advisory committee opted to make those comments themselves, and you will hear some of those later on this evening from the Department of Natural Resources at least, and maybe other folks that are here tonight. The 4 general areas that we commented on were, first of all, transparency, and by that we refer to the public's ability to read Montana Power Company's plan and understand what the decisions were and how they were made. And we suggested that some additional work be done by the company to make that process clearer. They did, in one of our meetings, address our questions, so that I'm confident that the members of the committee understand now what the decisions were and how they were made, but that additional clarification isn't yet reflected in the plan which Montana Power Company filed. So the committee is interested in seeing some additional clarification so that interested people who get a copy of the plan can more easily understand what's in it. We also were interested in having a clarification of the cost and environmental impacts of the alternative resources that appear in the plan. And I think you'll hear more about that from the Department of Natural Resources. We also asked that in terms of the demand-side resources or conservation, that there be some more clear explanation of the company's goals and objectives relative to demand-side resources or conservation. And finally, we asked that there be some more clear information about the comparison of the performance of the plans which MPC identified as the finalist plans, from which they actually selected their preferred plan. And I believe that is the end of my comments for this evening, but I'd be happy to also answer questions.
I didn't get a chance to ask you these yesterday, and I'm asking you these as an individual, not in your capacity as facilitator. For
bids and approving or somehow getting involved in approving what the outcome of the bidding process is. That's something which the advisory committee spent a great deal of time about and finally decided not to recommend that you actively get involved in reviewing the bids yourself.
My questions are more for the bid procedure, not the substance of bid selection.
There are some areas that I think we want to, as a committee, revisit and talk more about, which have come up in several of our meetings, and those relate to how specific kinds of resources were treated or were failed to be treated in that bidding process. Demand-side resources we did not come forward, very many of them, in the competitive acquisition process, and we want to understand more clearly why that was the case. This is not the only avenue by which MPC acquires conservation. It has a number of programs in addition to the competitive acquisition, and it may be that it is more efficient for people with demand-side resources to just partake directly in MPC's programs as opposed to coming in through the bidding process.
Second area then is the question of the role of renewables and also the research and development question that was raised yesterday. I'd like your thoughts on both of those, and again, whether it's appropriate for the Commission to do anything concerning renewables in particular outside of its review of the lease cost planning process, holding workshops, getting at the issues for line extension policies or PV work groups or whatever.
Well, at the end of the meeting yesterday, I asked the Commission for some guidance as to how research and demonstration ought to fit into the utility plans. As you know, the rules presently, the rules by which the companies develop their integrated least cost resource plans don't address that. It came up both in the context of renewable resources and also MHD. Now, the MHD project would have been much larger, but we, as a group, haven't yet taken up and made any specific decisions about how those should be treated. Apparently, the bidding process did not identify as cost competitive at the present time renewable resources such as wind, but Montana Power Company has said to us we're concerned that was the result of the bidding process. We're thinking about what we should do. Should we set aside a small block of power and be willing to pay some ratepayer dollars or a combination of ratepayer and shareholder dollars in order to try to facilitate these resources coming online? As a committee, we haven't yet taken that up either. That may be one of the future topics. When I was a member of the Northwest Power Planning Council for the state of Montana, and we, in the plans that we wrote, in the action plan, we directed Bonneville to conduct some experiments with respect to geothermal power and I think some also with wind in order to facilitate those resources. Now, Bonneville is a much larger utility than the Montana Power Company. It has many more resources to bring to bear. So I'm not yet sure how much we should ask one individual utility to spend ratepayer and or shareholder dollars to try to move these resources along. Montana Power Company has said that they're involving itself in larger utility organizations like the EPRI and trying to work at it through a group of utilities, and that may be appropriate. But I think there's some real questions that we want to think about when we start moving away from cost effectiveness as one of our decision criteria and start spending money on resources that are not cost effective now. I think somehow together we need to develop some guidelines to limit those sorts of expenditures if we're going to get involved in it. The MHD project, had it been a demonstration project, would have been a very large project relative to most renewables such as wind or solar. So I guess at this point say to Montana Power Company that we think the plan should be revised because it is the only document that the public can go to try to understand what Montana Power Company intends to do over the next 2 years. And so although we don't want them to spend so much time rewriting the plan that it detracts from their effort to write the next one, we think it is important as a group to make the existing plan clearer so that other folks who are not involved in the advisory committee, who do not meet monthly with them and get the detailed briefings that we do, have a chance to understand the basic decisions that went into the plan, how they went together, and how they produced the result that Montana Power Company came up with.
Thanks very much. Are there any questions? DNRC, Dr. Nordell?
I'm Larry Nordell, Senior Economist with the Montana Department of Natural Resources. The department, as part of its responsibilities, administers the Montana Major Facility Siting Act. And over the years that we have worked with the Siting Act, we've become very concerned with the planning process that leads to the selection of resources. The Major Facility Siting Act governs the construction of large generating plants and transmission lines. Under the Siting Act, you cannot begin construction of a generating plant larger than 50 megawatts before receiving a certificate of environmental compatibility and public need. And the department, when faced with an application to build such a plant, conducts an extensive review of the economics of the plant and of alternatives, of the need for the plant, the load growth, the loads it will serve, and of its environmental and social implications. By the time the department receives an application, a considerable amount of money has gone into the selection of the utility's best plant, best choice, and the best site to locate that plant, and studying both the preliminary engineering design of the plant, estimating of its costs, and studying the existing environment, and projecting the environmental impacts of the plant. And millions of dollars, on the order of 10 million or more, has gone into the bringing the proposal to that point. The ability of the state or of interveners and of the Board of Natural Resources that has to make a decision to change the decision is limited at that point. There's a considerable momentum, and a considerable amount of time has been used up in reaching that point in the decision process. And the state's efforts, society's ability to change things is not much more than environmental mitigation or shifting of a site. On occasion, if a plant is not needed, it's possible to, it may be possible to change the construction schedule or to avoid its construction completely. Our concern was that the decision process that the state imposed through the Major Facility Siting Act, which is an evaluation of, an attempt to minimize or to balance ratepayer interests, such as costs, and society's interests, such as protection of the environment, to balance those types of issues, that consideration be moved to an earlier stage. And over the years that I've been involved with the department, which is now longer than I care to remember, we've spent a lot of effort working with Montana Power Company towards that end. About 4 years ago, we had the opportunity to take part in the Montana Power Company's Lease Cost Planning Advisory Committee. An effort which has, along with many other people's efforts, has culminated in bringing us to this point here, since the Commission adopted rules, guidelines governing filing of lease cost plans, which are very much consistent with the goals of the Major Facility Siting Act. The process that we've got today, for all of the failings or faults or weaknesses that will be pointed out in comments to you on this on Montana Power's lease cost plan filing, for all of those listed failings, I think it's important to remember how far we've come and how much better positioned we are to avoid the kinds of mistakes and the kinds of social costs and disputation that plagued us in the past. I think we've really drastically reduced the likelihood of making big mistakes that cost everyone so heavily. I don't think we will see another battle that cost us so heavily of the magnitude of the Colstrip decision. I think Montana Power is to be commended, and I think the Commission is to be commended very heavily for the faith they have put in this process and the way it appears to be working out. Now, having said that, now let me give you some of my concerns with the filing. The major drawback that I see to the plan as filed relates to the issue of transparency, and I will echo somewhat the previous two commenters. The plan is the only document that the general public has to understand the planning process and how Montana Power is making its decisions to balance the different choices that it has. The members of the advisory committee are in a privileged position in terms of the amount of information we've had access to, and in terms of our ability to ask Montana Power questions about things we don't understand, and to have big deficiencies in our knowledge rectified. The plan, as it stands, does not contain the information that would be needed by a member of the public coming in cold to understand how Montana Power evaluated the choices available to it and arrived at its selected plan. The big areas that I think information is missing is information on the cost and environmental externalities associated with the different resource choices, information on the nuts and bolts of the DSM program, of how DSM alternative measures were evaluated and assembled into the DSM programs, cost, performance, and supply curves of demand-side management resources, and a clearer explanation of how the final plan was determined to be best. Now, there's a problem with putting some of this information in there that comes out of reliance on the competitive bid. I was initially a skeptic in the move towards competitive bidding. I've been real pleased with the way it's worked out, but I've also had access to some, through signing of non-disclosure agreements, the department has had access to some information on costs and environmental externalities that's not available to the public. Montana Power is bound, apparently, by non-disclosure requirements imposed by its bidders from opening up that information to the general public. I don't know how that issue can be addressed, and I think the Commission needs to address it, and Montana Power needs to address it. The information is really necessary in order to understand how MPC evaluated the alternative resources. Second, a second issue that DNRC addressed in its comments and that I'd like to talk about very briefly here is an issue that involves the evaluation of resources that have extensive lobbying efforts behind them. I refer to them as special interest resources. But this issue goes beyond just that group of resources. It goes to the criteria under which MPC evaluates the plan. MPC broke the criteria down into 5 categories. If I can dredge the 5 up, I believe they were ratepayer interest criteria, such as near-term rates, present value of long-term revenue requirements, shareholder interests, return on equity type of issues, societal criteria, environmental externalities, impacts on air and water and other environmental amenities, risk and uncertainty, and reliability.
Not bad.
Two additional criteria have come up in discussions here and also come up continually in claims asserted by project sponsors for special treatment of their resources. One is jobs and the other is R&D benefits. And I'd like to just speak very, very briefly on each of those, although I could go on at incredibly boring length. On the jobs issue, DNRC's recommendation to Montana Power was that they not use jobs as a criteria in comparing resources. Jobs are clearly important and they're clearly benefits to the people who get them and to the communities in which they occur. They're important to healthy communities. But as far as an evaluation of a resource that you're going to buy and its ability to serve ratepayers and to serve society, jobs are part of the costs of the resource, not a benefit. Jobs that you get with one resource are at the expense of jobs that you would have gotten with another resource that you didn't buy. All resources, directly and indirectly, are going to provide jobs somewhere in the economy. The problem with putting in jobs as a beneficial criteria in the selection of resources is that you basically reverse the clock on technological progress, which tends to substitute equipment and information for manpower. And you will select a labor-intensive resource over a capital-intensive resource, even though the labor-intensive resource might cost you more money. I have less objection to using it as a tiebreaker, as Montana Power has chosen to do. But I think what will happen when you use it as a tiebreaker is what happened here, is that things are never really perfectly tied. So you've got it in there, but it's not a criteria, and it's not a dominating criteria. It doesn't do any damage. I would recommend to the Commission that you not push it further, not require any further consideration. On the R&D issue, as I mentioned talked at some length yesterday, the essence of R&D is that you don't know what the outcome is going to be, which means the project has risk associated with it. And if you buy a resource for its R&D potential, even though it's not cost-effective on other grounds, you're exposing ratepayers to some risk. And that risk can be important if it's a large resource, as was the case with the MHD facility, which at this point appears not to be an active project. Both of these issues tend to be claims about both of these issues tend to be made by project sponsors, and I think they need to be viewed very skeptically. That while lobbying on behalf of a project is certainly the right within the rights of a project sponsor, it's the Commission's job and other public agencies and the company too, to cast a real jaundiced eye on the claims made by project sponsors. The other points that I'll mention in passing are some issues that we thought we would like to see Montana Power address in the next plan. Pretty areas where the plan ought to be, the analysis in the plan ought to be expanded. I'll just mention a few of them, and three of them fall under the heading of expanding the scope of the integrated resource plan. We would like to see transmission and distribution expenditures, investments analyzed in the context of the IRP. We're not certain at this point how to do it, but I think it's a point that will be raised within the advisory committee. I point out in passing that MPC's planned T&D expenses are on the same order of magnitude as its resource acquisition expenses. We'd like to see fuel switching and natural gas included in the IRP process. And I'm not certain whether that means a separate natural gas IRP or whether fuel switching is the key for tying the two fuels together. I think fuel switching is a potential resource that's real attractive. We don't have all the information we need. I disagree with the Consumer Council. I think experiments in fuel switching are appropriate at this point. I don't see the problem with doing some small-scale experiments. The third area is the treatment of the capacity value of DSM measures. In a period in which Montana Power's resource need is mainly for capacity, it seems appropriate to weight the value of DSM measures by their ability to defer capacity. And I would also include in that their ability to defer transmission and distribution expenditures, which are capacity-based in terms of need. The final area that we asked for expansion of the IRP analysis relates to the treatment of discretionary loads. This was an issue that we did not ever raise in the advisory committee, mainly because we didn't think of it. MPC serves some large loads that may in the near term or in the longer term be discretionary. Contract loads where the contract may not necessarily have to be renewed if the purchaser has an alternate source of supply. In particular, we were concerned with MPC's continued service to Central Montana G&T received some review under the analytical tools developed for integrated least cost planning. The rate structure for that sale has my understanding is that the marginal rate is about 11 mils per kilowatt hour, and with a rate like that, the co-ops have no reason to pursue DSM, yet Montana Power has to acquire additional resources to serve growing loads in that area, and is in the somewhat odd position right now of buying power owned by the co-ops indirectly, the Antelope Valley Station, which it will resell at a blended rate back to the co-ops. This is not to say to cast any doubts on our part as to the validity of the Antelope Valley Station sale. It looks to us from the information we have like a real attractive resource, one that would be on the short list whether or not the co-op loads were there. But the co-op loads are, I believe, 47 megawatts and growing, and this is approximately a third of the size of MPC's near-term resource need. I'll be happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
See, I took care of most of the points I was concerned with yesterday. I'm not completely clear. Do you support a broad consideration of so-called social externalities, or do you prefer a focus on more narrow environmental externalities? The social externalities tend to be
the social externalities that belong in a resource evaluation tend to be site-specific.
You referred to controversy around Colstrip, for example.
Yeah, so those were social change issues, impact on public services. They're very difficult to evaluate on a generic basis without a site or a set of alternate sites to evaluate. So I don't think it's crucial to include them in the analysis at the IRP stage.
You would exclude effects on job creation from that consideration now.
In an impact analysis for an environmental impact statement, it may be appropriate to look at the job creation and impacts on job markets in a locality as an impact analysis and as a guide towards mitigation. If there's going to be a lot of job creation in an area where the labor market is very tight, then you may have some recommendations on job retraining, for example. You might have different recommendations in an area where there was a lot of unemployment. As far as jobs being a benefit of a project, I would recommend that you not try to throw them into any kind of a cost-benefit calculation or resource comparison calculation.
You talked about newer technologies tending to be less labor-intensive. Do you have any preference one way or the other for capital-intensive versus labor-intensive sources of power?
I'd like to see my rates kept low.
Without commenting one way or another as to whether or not I disagree, you referred to the MHD project a couple times. In your opinion, would that be an example of one of the more serious cases, both of the emphasis on jobs and R&D? And again, I'm not saying whether I agree or not. I'm asking what you think.
I think that project had a significant potential to impose costs on MPC and society beyond what the project sponsors were suggesting.
Is part of the problem with R&D, whether it's at the utility level or the regional level or directly or whatever, knowing when to pull the plug, walk away from the investment?
That's part of it, and part of it is knowing which projects to put money into in the first place and what the appropriate agency is for putting that money in. The utility industry relies on EPRI to pool its resources and its efforts towards research. I think that's appropriate. It reduces the amount of risk exposure on any one company, and the benefits will be spread widely in any case for those efforts that turn out to be successful. In any agency faced with trying to put money into research, it's got to decide which avenues look promising, look worth putting money in, and how far they're willing to go. I think that's a real problem, because the essence of it is that you don't know how they're going to turn out, and it's not always the obvious ones that turn out. We have all kinds of examples throughout history of pathways that look terrible that turned out to be brilliant successes, and other pathways that looked obviously that they were going to lead somewhere and didn't. It's a real gamble, and the question is, how much of a gamble is it worth taking when for an agency whose mission is providing low-cost, reliable electric service?
You support capability building, is that correct? As a flexible planning tool?
Mm-hmm.
And you support allowance for prudently incurred expenses, even if those expenses don't lead to generation or to a new resource if they're part of a lease cost plan. Is that correct? I can't recall
I've testified to that effect in previous rate cases, yes.
are you satisfied that the distinction yesterday was kept sufficiently clear between research and development on one hand and various kinds of capability building expenses on the other?
I think there were no obvious conflicts no obvious inconsistencies that I saw.
Great. Any other questions? Thank you very much. Stone container, Mr. Jerry Stewart.
Good evening, Commissioner Rowe. My name is Jerry Stewart. I am General Manager of the Stone Container Corporation pulp and paper making facility on Mullen Road near Frenchtown. Our address is Lot 4707, Missoula 59806. Our written comments in response to the Montana Power's load forecast and integrated lease cost resource plan, I'm sure to many appeared to be a little heated and strong. And they were primarily based on some of the frustrations that I've heard from other folks tonight. And while I will admit that we now have some information received today, as a matter of fact, that we would like the opportunity to study and explore a little bit. At the time that we submitted our comments to the plan, the frustrations were not so much in the process of bidding. It was in trying to understand the process of the analysis itself. We find it very difficult to follow. Stone Container is very experienced in this process, working with cogeneration concepts, working with utilities and integrating those into the systems. It's something that we're very comfortable with, we're very experienced with, and yet as we went through this process, we had a very difficult time following. And I know that at times it appeared that we were shouting that there appeared to be a bias against demand-side management, but it was primarily related to the fact that there appeared to be an inconsistency in the analysis process that led us to think that perhaps there was a bias. Particularly when the results of the study changed, or were changed when some new load and resource information was introduced. I find it difficult to understand how new information can be introduced on that end of the business when we're held very, very sternly to the black and white of the proposals in the analysis phase of the since that time, however, as I think we in Montana Power have worked more and more together, we've become to understand the system a little better. We're very encouraged with the opening of discussions between us on our DSM-1 or Stone B project as a demand-side project, as a demand-side management project. We still feel very strongly that there are tremendous benefits to all concerned in our demand-side management 2 project known as Stone C. Many of the premises used to generate Stone B are included in Stone C. And in any event, I certainly don't want to compromise the sacredness of negotiations here in a public hearing. So we're very enthused about negotiating with Montana Power. We look forward to exploring its value with them, and we would certainly like to explore further the value of the other demand-side projects. I think with that I will, at this time, I am certainly not in a position to modify our written statement. I would like the time to study these, and perhaps a modification to the statement would be in order at a later date.
I should probably take that back to the commission. I think all the parties are represented here. Is there any objection to giving them that opportunity, again, just in the interest of getting all the information out we possibly can? Any objection? I'll raise the issue with the commission, and why don't you try to get something to us by the end of next week?
Okay.
Are there any questions? Thank you very much. Additional public witnesses? Mr. Taverner? Ms. Nessery? Bonneville Power? You don't want to take a shot at Dr. Nordell, or? Human Resource Council?
Commissioner Rowe. For the record, my name is Jim Morton. I'm the Executive Director of District 11 Human Resource Council. My business address is 617 South Higgins, Missoula, 59801. As one of the parties to the original agreement that created the Lease Cost Planning Advisory Committee, I do want to echo Gerald Mueller and Larry Nordell's comments about how far we've come. But my concern is that in that whole process, we were attempting to do a number of things. One, of course, we wanted to limit the drain on resources of all the parties involved in contested cases. But also we wanted to get out to the public how the company made its decisions. We've been very fortunate in being able to have a consultant at the committee meetings, as have the Environmental Information Center and the Northern Plains Resource Council. The company has set aside funds for that purpose. That does levelize the playing field for those of us who are consumer groups. But as evidenced tonight, the general public isn't here. And we have widened the input and the ability to get information, but it still needs to get out to the citizenry. And in that criticism, I'm including my own organization. We have to do more. But I would really encourage the commission and you and your fellow commissioners especially to get out, talk to organizations, talk to individuals, talk to other public officials, to request that the company synthesize this down so that people understand it. As we see time and time again, if the public does not understand it, it's not going to go anywhere. You and your fellow commissioners are elected. Other public officials who will bring pressure to bear will start to respond to constituents. If the constituents are confused or feel they have been misled or not informed, no matter how many times you refer them to the legal pages of the newspaper and tell them there was a hearing, that doesn't matter. They're going to feel cheated. And I think that is my biggest concern, is that the people who aren't here tonight and who probably have a lot of faith in those of us who are here need to constantly be shown that their faith is well placed, that we do make an attempt to get this back. The technical comments that you've received, I'm sure you're going to take under consideration, but for the general public, those are meaningless. When they get the bill, that's the meaningful part of this whole process. So that would be my comment.
Sure. Are there questions?
I'm Tom Waring from the Montana Power Company, Butte, Montana, 40 East Broadway. I was very interested in what Mr. Morton has to say because as part of the team that's been working on lease cost planning and concern for public processes for Montana Power, we've really had that concern, and it's really been a challenge to us as to how we can have the general public realistically and properly input, and how they can get the information so that they may be interested. And we'll continue to really work on that challenge, and I think there must be some ways to improve it, but I guess I bring up a couple questions. One, will the general public really come to a meeting of this type unless there's really something at stake or something they're very concerned about? And I'm not saying that in a way that I I'm intending to challenge the idea of still making every best effort to involve the general public, and I guess then I ask some folks here if they have any ideas tonight as we, Montana Power, go on with our planning process and try to have forums and involve the general public, how we might go about that. And I'm sure that the Commission's interested in the same thing, and Mr. Morton has suggested how we might expand the publicity and how things may be written so the public may understand what we're doing. But I would be interested in any comments or suggestions on that.
Additional public comment at this time? In closing then, I want to thank, first of all, the court reporter, Kathy Riebig, for giving up her evening to be here, and Carrie Hinkle and her volunteers at Missoula Community Access Television. This is being broadcast over community TV right now, and for precisely the reason that Mr. Morton mentioned. My experience is that people in Missoula actually do watch that and should be an informed public, and that's the reason I wanted you all over here and wanted you to spend a few minutes was to give you the opportunity to get your thoughts out in a more comprehensive way. One of the most frustrating things, probably for all of us, and certainly for me in this job, is that public attention, press attention is very episodic. The more we can do to counter that, the better. I agree with everything that Jim Morton said, and would note that I've actually been doing a fair amount of that for the last couple of months. I know that other people with the company and elsewhere have been doing that as well. Commissioner McCaffrey, as you know, held a hearing in Billings last week